If a landlord didn't have one, he's potentially at risk of a manslaughter charge. Quite simply, gas safety regs. They've been out for absolute years, 1998, amended in 2018. So, a gas certificate must be done prior to the commencement of a new tenancy. Firstly, not having a gas certificate is a criminal offence, and the penalties are up to £5,000 fine and or 6 months in prison. So quite a serious piece of legislation. And sadly, quite recently in our local area, one of which in Wolverhampton and one of which in Birmingham, over I'd say the last 4 years, there have actually been 2 gas explosions in properties where the property literally has been blown to smithereens and the occupiers have not survived. So this is really, really important because if either of those properties were a private rented property, the first thing the investigators, the police, whoever's involved will ask is, where is your gas certificate? And if a landlord didn't have one, he's potentially at risk of a manslaughter charge. Okay, so although it's been around for ages and it is common sense, it is a really important part of our legislation. It must be renewed annually, so every year it must be renewed. And it must be carried out by a gas safe engineer, okay? Now, the gas safe engineer, you need to make sure is qualified to do all of the check. The reason I say that is I have met people that don't know or understand that a gas engineer is qualified to do specific things. So when you go onto the gas safe register and you find a gas engineer, it will list the type of work that they're able to carry out. Lots of gas engineers are not qualified to work on gas fires, for an example. And in fact, one of my clients found out that actually the gas engineer that she'd been using for a whole 12 months was not able to certify gas fires, and therefore all of her gas checks were invalid because he didn't have the right qualification to carry out checks on the gas fires. So please make sure that when you're using gas engineers, you're checking that the engineer is qualified to do the works. The answer is, if you're not checking that that person is gas registered, you should check that that person is gas registered, because you will be managing the property potentially with an invalid gas certificate, and therefore, unfortunately, you guys get liability again. So please do, if you're accepting a certificate that's not from one of your contractors, make sure you're checking that the gas engineer is registered and qualified to do the work. A copy must be given to all tenants individually, but basically, you need to make sure that if there's 4 tenants, you're giving them 4 copies of the gas certificate. Ludicrous, I know. But now that we're doing electronic signatures, it should go out to all 4 parties anyway, and they would all get a copy of the gas cert if it's present. Renewed gas certificates must be provided to all tenants within 28 days. Within 28 days of the certificate being renewed, you then need to send out a further copy on the tenant. So if you guys are serving any documentation or anything that you are legally required to serve via email, you need to make sure that you have got the permission within your tenancy agreement that the tenants will accept documentation served via email, and the email address is in there. If you want to serve via email, you need to have all permission from all tenants in the contract. The law was amended in 2018, whereby they basically said you could do an MOT style gas certificate. What that means is that as long as the gas certificate hasn't passed its expiry date for the previous 2 years, then the certificate can be carried out before its expiry date, but on the certificate it can have the original expiry date. So basically what it's allowing you to do is it's allowing you to get the gas certificate done early so that it doesn't expire, but still the landlord gets the full 12 months benefit. But there is caveats around that, okay? So that can be done up to 2 months prior to expiry. Please remember that the gas regulations forms part of the Deregulation Act of 2015 and will affect your service of notice if you don't comply. And as I've said, the penalties are £5,000 fine and 6 months in prison. I would say that if you're accepting a gas cert and you're going to move a tenant in on that basis, whether let only fully managed or not, then you should check the validity of the person that's provided it. Because you're going to hand over the keys on a let only. At that point, you will be the person moving the tenant in. You have a law under HMO regulations that you must display all certificates in the house, which is quite often a question I'm asked, is that sufficient? It isn't sufficient because, one, you can't prove that you've served the document to them prior to the start of tenancy. So it's not being served. So it's not sufficient. You need to continue to do that for your HMO regs, but for these regs, you must serve it on the tenant. In court, a landlord will ask you for a copy of your gas certificate and evidence on how you've served it. If it is being served via email and you are only sending it to one tenant, there is an argument there, though, that the other tenants have not received it because that tenant might not have shared it with them. So belt and braces, I like best practice, serve it to all. And the how to rent guide and everything else that you need to serve at renewal. So when serving notice, we only serve one notice addressed to all tenants. But if, let's say there's two tenants, we serve notice via email and first class post. So if we're serving notice via email and there's two tenants, we will send a copy of the notice and the documents to both parties via email, but one letter to the house, if that makes sense, because you can't think, like me and my partner, for example, you emailing me doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to share it with him. So if you're doing it via email, it needs to be individually, but if you're sending it to the property, then it can just be one document addressed to both parties at the property. If you're sending essential documents, so you need to send DREG docs before you serve the notice, then my recommendation is you serve it to the house addressed to both parties, but you might want to enclose two gas certificates, for example.